Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to those who've joined us thus far. We're getting ready for our part 3 of our cross-cloud collaboration series, Risk Mitigation Strategies for Cross-Cloud Collaboration. I'm going to give everyone a couple more minutes to get logged in, and then we will get started. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody, for those on the East Coast, and good morning still for our West Coast friends. Welcome to part 3 of our cross-cloud collaboration series. My name's Karen. I will be your MC for the next hour, and we'll be joined by Jay Leask and Bill Wootton. They'll be turning on their cameras shortly. We'll be chatting today about risk mitigation strategies for cross-cloud collaboration. And as soon as they come on screen, we will get started.
Here we are.
There you are. There's Bill. There's Jay. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. Everyone here, you're in for a treat. This is going to be a great discussion. It's always a fun time when Bill and Jay talk and collaborate. I'll just cover a couple of housekeeping items to kick off here. We will be able to, this is live, we'll be able to answer your questions. You should see a question module as part of the webinar interface. Please feel free to submit any questions that you'd like. We'll hold those until the end. And then anything that we don't get to, we'll be sure to communicate out on via email when we wrap things up. No need to take furious notes. We'll be making this webinar as well as the slide deck available publicly after the webinar is completed. So you'll have that resource as well. And then lastly, when the webinar is finished, if you leave your browser window open for just a minute, you'll get a link to a survey. We'd love to get some of your feedback. If you close the browser, then it goes away and you're out of luck and so are we. So if you wouldn't mind answering a few questions, we sure would appreciate it. So that's it. I'm done. And now I'm going to hand things off to Bill to get us started.
Sounds great. Thank you, Karen. Jay, let's try that next slide.
Here we go.
Cool. All right. First success of the show. I like it. Quick intro. My name is Bill Wootton. I'm president of C3 Integrated Solutions. We are a IT services provider that is dedicated to the defense industrial base. That is the core of our business. We work with folks across the defense industry to figure out their strategy around things like NIST and CMMC, deploy those technological strategies, and manage their environments. We've been working in this space really in a dedicated fashion for over 5 years now. We've done work across all of the various versions of the Microsoft Cloud, and in particular, GCC High. We've been able to work there for about 5 years now, being one of the original 5 in the AOSG program. Jay, welcome. Thank you. Please do a quick intro. I'm so excited to have you back with us today.
Bill, thank you. So my name is Jay Leask. I'm the Director of Federal Strategy. I also help to run our national security program. So the defense industrial base is a huge part of not just how we support our customers, but who our customers are. AvePoint is an ISV. Microsoft ISV, certified gold partner. We provide tools to help you migrate, manage, and protect your data, not just in Microsoft 365, but historically speaking, that is a primary place that we've worked in. One of the things I love about the conversation we're going to have here, Bill, is people are thinking about cross-cloud collaboration. They're thinking B2B, or they're thinking the old SharePoint sharing capabilities. And I think this conversation is going to be great because it's going to remind people that in order to use even those capabilities, you need to pause and think about what data do you have so you know what you're sharing as part of that strategy. So thank you for letting me be a part of that with you. And hopefully our attendees get a lot out of today's conversation.
I certainly hope so too. So great, let's get this thing started. This is actually the second webinar, and what we're doing is a little bit of a 3-part series. Our first webinar, Richard Wakeman from Microsoft was nice enough to join us and do a really good, deep conversation around the new capabilities that have just been kind of released in preview around cross-cloud collaboration. So what I want to do is just take a minute and hit a couple of highlights and kind of set up our conversation that you and I are going to have as we go through today's webinar. And the first thing to kind of talk to is a little bit about this idea of a collaboration framework. And when we present this concept, we recognize that really when we talk about who's active and who's involved and who maybe even have access to your environment, it's kind of a series of concentric circles. That starts with obviously your own internal organization, the users that are within your internal tenant. You may not trust all of them equally. You may have different levels of trust across those individual users, but those folks inside your tenant are going to be that core component there. The next layer as we work outward in these circles is some folks that may be within your own legal entity, your own organization, but live in a different tenant. So a great example of this is folks that have deployed a data enclave. You may have an enclave in GCC High. You may have users external to that are in the commercial tenant, but you still have some need to share information with those folks. And as we work through this, kind of the interesting concept here is the more visibility you have on those individual users, the more you can accurately trust those users, or maybe not trust those users as the case may be. Now, we see this in the next layer out when we start talking about business partners. We know everyone in the defense industrial community has a myriad of teaming partners. Sometimes they're a sub, sometimes they're a prime, sometimes they're high or low on that food chain. And across those level of organizations, depending on your relationship with them, you may have a different level of confidence in what they've done for their own internal security. DFAR 7020 starts to apply that with the SPRS score. We've seen other contractors go so far as to establish memorandums of understanding to put into writing really what they're doing to protect their own environments. So again, one less layer of visibility, but still maybe different layers of confidence in their individual security. And then that last piece is the greater 365 ecosystem, organizations that you may interact with from time to time, but you have a much more casual relationship with and don't really have a lot of visibility and therefore a lot of confidence in what they do to protect their environment. So as we move over to the next slide, we'll kind of take that next step. And this is kind of where Richard talked a little bit about the fact that when we open up the ability to share information across tenants, there are things we can do at the tenant level to control those access settings. We can block or allow access to apps and data. We can do things like multi-factor authentication. We can accept the device compliance in those tenant boundaries, visibility into the global address list, as well as things like allowing moves between the tenant as well. Now, the device piece is one of those things that's really interesting because you can validate device compliance on a third-party tenant, but you are inheriting their compliance settings. So this goes back to why it's important to have that conversation with whoever you're sharing with. You may require 5, 6, 7 things for device compliance. They may only require 1 or 2 of them, and therefore you got to make sure that you're actually understanding what you're getting when you do that. So Richard went on. He had a really great conversation about the details on what cross-cloud is and how to enable it and how to set it up. But I think the important thing is to realize we're finally getting access to do this. And this is probably the biggest thing that we've been asked for over those last 5 years that we've been working with GCC High. But now that these doors have been kind of opened up, we still need to start talking a little bit about how do we control who goes through those doors and what access do users or other organizations have once they get in. So I think one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about today is if we look about this in terms of zero trust, we want to look at it in a way that requires users to authenticate at every step. And this is true when accessing collaboration sites and collaboration workplaces such as Teams and SharePoint. And while we just talked a little bit about the tenant level, I think it's important for us to focus today on what can we do at the workspace level with Teams and SharePoint. So Jay, let's get you in here. Let's start talking a little bit about zero trust and how does this apply to a workspace collaboration type approach?
Thank you, Bill. What I love about the setup that Richard gave here is he's talking about zero trust. He's talking about multi-factor authentication, so user level permissions. He's talking about device level permissions. All of these things are part of, and if I hit the next button appropriately, there we go, part of the core pillars of zero trust. It's about making sure that the technology enabled and keeps only people who should be allowed in your environment accessing your environment. And I just realized I have a set of glasses in my pocket. Apologies for that. When we look at zero trust, however, one of the conversations that we have had time and time again in this space, in the defense industrial bases where it came out of, frankly, is that there's this gap between the user and the data. And what I mean by that is if we're securing down to the user level, then we're not ensuring that they can only see the content they should see. And sometimes that's what we do when we natively use the B2B capabilities to bring someone into our team. We're adding them to our team, but what kind of restriction do we have to make sure they should be able to see the content in that team? If we're going down to the data level, you and I have had this conversation a number of times. We're relying on the user to actually tag the data so that we can put DLP permission security around that piece of information. And so as we've matured this conversation over the last couple of years with our customers and our partners, what we've identified is this idea of, and I've been quoted as saying sixth pillar, because to me, that marketing effort ensures people actually listen to the conversation, but I recognize that that also shuts just as many people out. But this idea that there's this workspace category that needs to be talked about, that in a Venn diagram, yes, overlaps the data and the user. Looking at the workspace, though, it allows us to make sure at the container level, we are programmatically setting policies and security to keep only the right people accessing this information. So whether or not you allow users to access your tenant, whether or not you build that trust and establish that relationship between you and another tenant to accept their device policies and accept their MFA. Whether or not you do that, you're also making sure that when I let Bill Wootton into AvePoint's tenant, I'm only letting him see information that Bill should see. He's not going to mistakenly gain access to other content. And by doing it at the workspace level, we're kind of taking that responsibility away from the user, who is historically terrible at categorizing data, and putting it at the workspace where we know this workspace is for this kind of collaboration.
Yeah, it sounds great. I mean, the last thing you want to do is let someone who is not a trusted partner. I always like to beat up on the marketing folks. We don't necessarily have a lot of need for validating that stuff, and you inadvertently let them into a sensitive technical site that's got a lot of drawings that they don't need to have. And once you let them in, finding that way to kind of differentiate where they have access is so important. Tell me a little more about it from a programmatic level. Like, what do we need to know? What do we need to do? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons that we do this is by pulling it up to the workspace level, you can tie this whole conversation into the three primary categories of a workspace lifecycle. When you are provisioning something, you can ask questions like, do we want to enable self-service provisioning? Do we have a combination of self-service where it's appropriate, but approvals and programmatic implementation where it's needed, conditional access and conditional approvals, for example? In the ongoing management perspective, if you have gone through the effort of setting security and controls so that, me as the team owner can't add a foreign person to a workspace without cybersecurity's approval, what kind of management do you have in place to enable me to still do my job managing the team, since you've probably locked it down so I can't change those policies, right? So ongoing management's another big part of that. And by doing it, again, at the workspace level, where we're looking at provisioning, saying, what do we need to capture? We're looking at ongoing management, saying, what do we need to be able to change? And then tying it to the end of life of your workspace as well, where we're not just confirming that it is in fact time to archive or remove a team, but hey, there were records in there. It was a project team, a team assigned to a project. There were contracts there. There were decision documents created. What do we do with those records at the end of this? And by, again, building this all into your zero trust model, you can make sure that Bill is only getting access to the workspaces, the teams he's supposed to be able to have access as an external user, that Jay is only able to change the policies and the controls around the workspace that he's allowed to change, and that when it comes time to deleting this, we're not deleting something with critical mission data that shouldn't be deleted without the right approvals in place. Now, you asked, what do we need to know to be able to do that? One of the conversations that we have with most of our customers is at the very beginning of this, understanding what types of workspaces will you need. So in that provisioning thing, the very first bullet, Bill, was, are you going to set up a self-service catalog? And you and I have talked about this before. If I'm going to restrict how people use the system, I better give them a catalog of what's actually possible, so they don't sit there fumbling for hours at a time and lose their engagement, right?
Absolutely.
So this types of workspaces conversation is all about understanding, as an organization, we want the system to be used a particular way. We want to make sure that, when we have a department team, every department team gets a team and a SharePoint site connected to it. When we set up a community of practice, we're going to put them, well, okay, we're talking about GCC High, so we're not going to use Yammer, but but you can see we're defining with the type of workspace, how should it be used. Now, additionally with that, and one of the conversations we have is there's going to be more than 3 types of workspaces. And if you're thinking about the outcomes that are associated with these, then we can talk about, for example, in a customer project, the controls that we want to include with this are when we do backups, whether or not external users are allowed, what type of recertification is there, and Lease expiration is another term that's often used about that. But how often does that happen? And what kind of reporting do we need? So we can set in that customer project, a project has a start date and an end date. We're going to do recertification at the end of the contract. And if they still need it, they can extend that lease. But at the same time, they're confirming the people who have access to it should. In addition to that, though, Bill, and this is where we really get into the security of, or the how to support the zero trust of cross-tenant collaboration, cross-cloud, is what metadata is involved in that. Like, we know it's a customer data, so we're going to put the customer proprietary metadata associated with that, any labels that are associated with that, and any kind of other SharePoint columns and things we need to capture to trigger the right DLP policies and the right actions. And if you're doing some form of self-service catalog, whether it's cloud governance as seen on the screen, or you're using the Power Platform to create all of this yourselves, you can ask these business questions. How is this going to be used? What type of regulated data is there going to be? And who should have access to this? You can ask those questions in a way that enables you to automatically provision these workspaces with the right controls associated with it out the box. So, you know, going back to that, let's go to a vendor extranet example, which is more fitting with the conversation we're having. If you need the type of workspace that allows that external collaboration with users, you probably are looking at in this case, a vendor extranet. And with that vendor extranet, we are going to allow external users. We're going to make you do recertifications every 6 months instead of annually. And we're going to provide reporting annually so you can see what are vendors doing, what do they have access to, et cetera. This really enables you to secure that content as you go, so that when those users come in, they're only accessing the right stuff.
Yeah, great stuff, Jay. Great stuff. I want to take a minute, back up a half a second. All of these concepts, we're super focused on the defense industrial base, but let's also just acknowledge that conceptually, the types of things that we're talking about here apply to any organization that does outside sharing. And whether you're going cross-cloud or not, a lot of these concepts, everything we're talking about, certainly applies to GCC and commercial as well. And anyone that has a supply chain or sits in some part of its supply chain, these various concepts of how much data do you share, how do you decide who you trust, and how much do you trust them with certain information, conceptually, all of this is the same. We're just kind of really zeroing in on the defense industrial base because that's where we spend the most of our time. Certainly as an organization, I know you guys do as well. But as we kind of shift back into talking a little bit about the defense industrial base, we typically will see a couple of different flavors of data. We'll see data that's pretty much available public, using that term loosely, federal contract information, CUIs, controlled unclassified information, and then we'll see what they like to call CUI specified, things that have an incremental rule beyond CUI, things like ITAR data. Those are generally the four categories we'll tend to bump into as we're working with our clients. How can we use some of these concepts with that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked, because this is actually a story that came out of the defense industrial base. So one of our customers, somewhere around the 50,000 mark in Microsoft 365, as the pandemic hit, Microsoft pushed for them to adopt Teams. And when they looked at Teams, they realized the way Microsoft 365 provisioning is enabled, the way the tool management happens. If I'm an intern at your organization doing some summer work and I go to Teams and I click create a team, I'm now the owner of that team. Within the full confines of the tenant, I can control anything that happens in that team. I can go into SharePoint, and I've now got the SharePoint site collection administrator role, which would scare any traditional SharePoint administrator, right? My intern is a full SCA, like that's not acceptable. So,
and by the way, it's a public team that they created, so it's searchable for anyone in the tenant. Let's just, while we're scaring,
really make it worse. Yes. So this concept here is making sure, put it through a service catalog, figure out how people are going to use it, ask business questions. Who are you trying to collaborate with? People in my team, people across the company, people outside the company. I didn't ask a technical question, but I found out whether or not B2B collaboration was going to be necessary, right? Also, you're collaborating with people across the company. Let's find out on what you're collaborating so we can figure out how to secure it, right? In the particular question that you asked, Bill, and this is just representative of what you might do, but these are the kinds of things that you can go into as an organization as you identify the outcomes associated with each of those data types. So here you can see, is regulated data allowed in this team? We've identified you're making a team. We're going to ask a standard, non-committal, non-technical question. And in the case of our defense industrial base customer that we did this with most recently, they also included a little pop-up that said, you don't know what types of regulated data we have? Click here. Here's a SharePoint page with all of the types defined and what you need to know based on what that information is. Now, coming back to the representative example, you can see we've got 4 categorizations, the 3 types, FCI, CUI, ITAR, and then this public type, which is very representative of what that particular customer did, the no restrictions version. If saying I'm going to allow regulated data and having read the guidelines, I've decided there's going to be CUI in here, as an organization, you want to define, well, if we have a team with CUI, with CUI, who should be able to, who should be able to approve changes to that? So in this example, we're saying only, I did this as a federal use case, but only employees can actually approve changes to this workspace. And that tells me in a conditional approval process for ownership changes, for metadata changes, for lifecycle, an employee must be the person, not an intern, because they're a special employee categorization, not a contractor, etc. Who can be a member? Well, in this case, employees and contractors are going to be allowed in CUI with some restrictions. And the primary restriction that we might enable is that the employee says that the contractors are allowed to be part of that team, right? And so by knowing these pieces, we can start to build those conditional approval processes right into the process. Going down further, hey, if it's CUI, we're not going to allow cross-cloud collaboration. We're not going to let you invite a vendor in here. We are going to have restricted sharing. So in this particular case, what we did with our customer was if one of the sensitive data types was selected, we actually turned off the ability to share a file with people outside of the team. Bill, you ever go open a Word document or a PowerPoint and hit file and hit share?
Absolutely.
Right, and everybody on this call knows somebody who has tried to select share with everyone because it's the easiest, right? So in this particular case, knowing it's a highly sensitive piece of information, knowing that there are restrictions around it, you might not want to allow that. And so with this customer, we have scripts running in the back end that when we provision, when we know it's got ITAR or contract data, we're turning off that sharing capability. So I can't share outside of the team. Now, while that's restrictive, we're only doing it in the teams that have been identified as having this restricted information, which means if you stand up a running club or a team to support an office, and it's not expected to have that regulated data, you can decrease the amount of restrictions on it. And that enables Microsoft's native capabilities in some ways, right? It enables that communication, collaboration the way it's meant to be, only locking it down where you expect this information to be.
Fantastic. There's so much to dive into there. I think a couple important pieces there is to realize that there are so many different ways to cut this up and to slice this. There's different decisions to be made at the business level. I think it just reinforces how important it is, that first conversation. There's a couple of slides earlier where we talk about these are the things you need to think about when you are building a data governance strategy there. And as you kind of alluded to, this applies to whether it's private or public or even crossing those organizations there. There's so many different ways to kind of look at this. Let's talk a little bit about that data labeling and default labeling, what are the types of scenarios that you would want to actually create that default label?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question because there are literal religious debates about whether or not you can label and tag at the container level or if you have to do it at the data level. With this particular customer, we restricted what was possible from a management perspective at the workspace level, but we didn't go into the level of depth of classifying or labeling your content. With another customer of ours on the record side, during provisioning, we asked a question: what types of records do you expect? And they were able to select what based on it was in this case a government agency, right? The government has very strict records classifications and strategies. So they were able to say, I'm going to have these 5 records, and we spun up a document library for each of those records. With that spin up, we were able to attach the owning organization, the default status of draft, and the record. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on this. The rule that classifies what happens to that record. I can't believe I forgot the name of that word.
There you go.
But so for them, we were able to do that on a record side because we knew, hey, you're going to have this kind of record. This is how your people are trained to store records. We can automate all of this metadata in your SharePoint library. On the sensitivity side, we have another customer in the defense industrial base who, if they have CUI if they have a SharePoint site collection that has been identified as having CUI in it, we have a tool that's running in the background 24 hours a day, looking for new files in that site collection. And the minute that file drops, we are looking for it, we are capturing that it's been put in there, and we are adding the CUI label to that file. Now, for them, they've decided to do it at the workspace, the SharePoint site level, because it is more important that they do not miss a file than over labeling things. So for them, again, just to kind of reiterate that, if a file goes into a SharePoint site that has been identified as, let's say ITAR, because that's a really good one. That's one everybody knows about, right? The first thing that happens to that file as soon as it's been identified is it gets the label associated with ITAR, and then all the DLP policies, all the sharing restrictions can be applied automatically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, no, it's important, and again, not getting into the philosophical to the point of being religious conversations of what's right, what's wrong, or how to do it. It's about what's the capability of being able to do it and allowing organizations to make that business decision on where they're at. Now, of course, in that example, there's probably a situation there where you would probably want to at least have the ability to guard against overclassification.
Yes.
What kind of wrinkle do you have around that?
Yeah, so that's where this entire stack comes into play. So we're categorizing, labeling that information as ITAR, but we have an approver, right? We've identified that the export control office can say what changes have to happen in that workspace. Well, we can also do that at the data level. If I need to share something that is restricted, we can now build a process on how to release that document from that restriction, because we know who needs to be the person that approves it. Now, this is an oversimplification. You probably want a business person to be part of that decision as well. And in most cases, we do a 2-stage approval process. First, from a business perspective, saying, yes, it does make sense that this is shareable and that this is not ITAR itself. And then secondly, export control saying it is acceptable. Or even more, my favorite example of this, coming back from the data level, going back to the permission side, that customer I described earlier, they said if a workspace has ITAR data, foreign persons cannot be added to the workspace by default. But if you want to add a foreign person, that 2-stage approval process kicks in. 1, the business owner says, yes, this person has a need to know. And 2, export control kicks in and says they not only have a need to know, but they've been approved for seeing ITAR data. So it's
Right.
whether it's the data, the permissions, or the management, knowing who your approvers are gives you the ability to build that approval in to declassify, change permissions, change lifecycle, etc., safely.
Yeah, it's so important. It's we build these constructs, we build these rules, and to get some ability of scale with confidence, but also have the ability to let the business sort of almost breathe. And you know that there's always going to be an exception to the rule or situations that you know in advance are going to happen. How do you build that construct in a way that says, okay, these are scenarios where I'm willing to make an exception, and I can almost build the logic into the solution that you're putting forth for the organization and for those individual users.
Yep.
At one point, we were also talking in the prep side of things of the fact that even though we have these rules within the SharePoint site level, we can change that rule a little bit at the library level as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the federal customer I described, when it came to records, each library was able to get its own restrictions, its own metadata, its own default values. And so realistically, again, knowing, I'm going to go back to it because it's that important. Knowing what types of workspaces you need. Coming back here, watch me click around a little bit. The magic behind the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. Knowing what types of workspaces that you're going to need, and then being able to pair to those types of workspaces what the outcomes you're going to need enables you to programmatically do it, whether it's at the team, the site, or as you mentioned, the library level. Being able to define this ahead of time allows you to programmatically do as much as possible before needing to engage ServiceNow and the IT help desk to get the exceptions put into play.
Yeah, great point. And I love the fact that you went back into those slides a couple slides earlier, because it is so important to think through these things about what you want to do and what that limits are. I know in terms of prepared remarks, we're kind of wrapping up on this end of it. I want to just give you a chance, one more thing before we jump into questions of, as an IT admin sitting out there who now has the opportunity to open up cross-cloud, probably has like the BD team and some other folks beating down her door saying, yeah, I need this. I need
it now.
Yeah. Where do we start? What are the 2 or 3 takeaways you really want someone coming out of this with to say, all right, I need to think about fill in the blank?
Yeah. So whether you are going with a third-party tool like AvePoint or you are building it yourself, these are the 5 primary pieces that we really make our customers think about. 1, you need a catalog of your workspaces. You need to understand what workspaces we have, how are they being used, who has access to them, who should have access to them, and what kind of conditional approvals do we need for exceptions handling. That catalog is the very first line of defense to making sure that your system is used the way you want it. And by the way you want it, I mean securely, of course. The second piece of that is, as you're designing your policies and your procedures, you want to be able to prioritize security issues. So if we go back to those the 3 data types I had on that previous slide, the public first of all, but ITAR, FCI, and CUI, right? If you go back to those, you can prioritize what needs extreme security, fully locked down, users can't make changes on their own, and what doesn't. The runners club, the office team, where, I mean, my office, we have a channel for the coffee club and the channel for the pie club and a channel for our quarterly outings, right? There's a valid use for that. But oh my gosh, can you imagine? Our team would just stop using it if they weren't able to create their own channels in there. And so prioritize security where it needs to be prioritized, but then leave it looser. Oh, I just spilled my drink. Leave it looser where it's not necessary. We'll towel that up in a little bit.
Fair enough.
The third piece, automate. So I help customers, I help federal agencies create governance plans and create information architectures. And the very first thing I tell them when they're all excited about the policies they're designing and the rules they're creating, the very first thing I tell them is, okay, how are you going to enforce this? And they look at their staff and they look at that policy that everybody's heard over the last decade more and more, do more with less. And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well, then we are wasting everybody's time, because if you have a policy but no enforcement of that policy, no one's gonna follow it. So automate as much as you can. So as you're designing these policies, think about how can we automate these steps to make sure they're followed. And then you want to monitor what's important. So I know that this workspace has ITAR data because I've been told it's going to. Should I worry about looking for ITAR data in that workspace? No. I can decrease the amount of effort going into that workspace because I know it's been locked down. And I can focus my efforts on the who has access to, who's creating sharing links in the public spaces. And where I'm putting manual eyes, I can make sure they're focusing where the higher risk is. And then that last piece, you know, do what you're gonna, or say what you're gonna do what you're doing, and then prove that you did it. That validate your outcome. Make sure that you have something in place to help you identify risk of exposure, to help you identify where something has been shared or downloaded when it shouldn't have been. These are our 5 core pillars for, you know, enabling zero trust in the workspace. And I think what you'll find is, as you look at the 6, I'm going to use the word pillars again, sorry about that, the 5 pillars of zero trust. Look at that, I'm instinctively saying 6. You're going to find that without looking at the workspace level, that automation becomes really hard. Knowing where to monitor becomes really hard. Being able to prioritize security becomes really hard because you're relying on users to tag things, and that's never a good idea.
Fair enough. We got to get you to copyright on that 6 pillar. So we're moving along. We're at a really great pace here. We have the opportunity to kind of move over into some questions. And Karen, what do we got?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, we have a couple questions from our audience, and if anyone else has questions, I would definitely encourage you to submit them. Our first one is, how do you handle clients who are less savvy with DLP, AIP, and MS encrypted files? These clients don't want our encryption on their files that we are delivering to them.
Whew. Bill, you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, so many different ways to go there. You know, I think the first one's education, explaining why there is a need, and you know, with that client, having conversations, and well, maybe the first step's really understanding what's the data you are handing over to that client, whether that's you're sending that file in an attachment or you're sharing pieces with it. There is it always goes back to what's the data are you holding? Does that data really need to have that CUI designation, or is it more of a lighter level of responsibility? And then that next step starts to become that education area. You know, here's why we need to do this, and then part of that's a security, part of that's a compliance component as well. You know, hey, it's important for us to do this, but by the way, we go there. I think where we're going to see some companies start going soon is also that goes to the level of trust as well. If you have partners who are not respecting your data, who aren't considering it valuable, and it really is, say, controlled technical information, maybe it's a sensitive drawing, maybe it does have an ITAR component on it, you know, that's a little bit of a different level of conversation around, you know, can I continue to trust that partner, and how do you evaluate that business decision? That's kind of taking it to an extreme, but let's face it, if you're handing over your intellectual property to another organization, you are trusting them with that data. If that's leaking out the back door to some malicious actor, I almost just spilled my own drink, some other malicious actor, then that's a problem, and that becomes a risk for you as an organization. So what do you think, Jay?
We're clearly very handsy speakers.
Yes.
So I think the one thing I would add to that, I do a lot of presentations on what the role of IT is in a business. And the role of IT is to solve business problems. So if you have someone, even a customer, who comes back and says, I don't want technology XYZ, you got to understand why. And as much as I hate to ask the question, like, I know I need to put DLP on this, ask them what happens on their end when you send that information that is a blocker for them to be able to do what they want, what they need to do with it. And I think you're going to find more often than not that as you work through the why is this a roadblock, you're going to help them understand why this is important, and you'll be able to find a middle ground, whether it's, you know, less restriction or it's a different method of handling this information, a different way of delivering it, something along those lines. You should be able to find that compromise that is appropriate for the level of sensitivity as you work through the why is this a problem with them, and educate them, like Bill said.
Yeah, and I think also to some extent, you kind of triggered one more piece there is understanding the data you're sending over and recognizing why it might be a problem for them. If you are putting an extra layer of encryption on an email before you send it out, and that end recipient doesn't have the ability for whatever reason to cleanly open it up or use it, you know, there may be functional problems that are creating issues. And you take a step back and think, well, you know what? 365 is FIPS 140-2. The majority of content's probably okay at the base level of encryption. Do I trust the person receiving it, opening it up in an encrypted environment? If those answers are all yes, maybe that's good enough.
Right.
So kind of does go back to understanding a little bit of those concepts as well.
Yep. Yeah. The last piece I would add to this is I did an interview about 4 or 6 months ago with a federal CISO. And he said, my job as a CISO is to enable you to be able to do your job. It is not to restrict you from being able to do your job. So if the encryption requirement is coming down from your security department, helping them understand why the encryption is a problem is the only way you're going to get them to listen and help you come up with a solution that fits both you and your customers' need. Yep. So I think that's key, right?
Absolutely. Karen, what else we got?
Sure. This was a good one, actually, about C3 and AvePoint. Question came in, how long have C3 and AvePoint been working together? Can you give us an example of client engagement if we need assistance with cross-cloud collaboration?
Geez, how long have we been working together? That's a good question.
So I've been here 6.5 years, and
okay. I was at your orientation, and no, just kidding.
If I remember correctly, you guys were actually one of the first to test our modern migration tool in GCC High, and that was 4.5 years ago. Yep. So yep. I imagine we're in the 5 to 6 year range at a minimum.
You know, I think that's where things really started. And when we were ramping up in GCC High around 5 years ago, we were looking for a company that could represent and attest to being able to move ITAR data. I remember that first conversation with Sam Valmy sitting at the corner bakery and explaining to him what DFARS meant, and him just his eyes glazing over and being like, "This guy's crazy." And you know, look how far it's come now. We've easily used you guys for over 100 migrations. I'm sure the number's way north of that at this point. And we were lucky enough to help you guys bring back up into the GCC High space.
Yep.
You know, I'd be remiss without pointing out you guys if not one of the only partners that have that FedRAMP designation for cloud-based backup. That's a huge deal. I don't think anyone else has that at this point in the industry. And now the exciting part is we're getting to work on these more complex conversations and challenges for folks.
Yeah, you know, appreciate you mentioning mentioning the capabilities that are there. You know, the relationship over the last 5 or 6 years has enabled us to grow and expand these capabilities. I think you and I did a webinar 2 or 3 years ago now, when the Department of Defense, it was just at the beginning of COVID, when the Department of Defense was rolling out Microsoft 365 defense-wide, right? And we started talking about, well, how do you secure these different types of information inside of a tenant? We weren't even talking about cross-cloud at the time. And so being able to take those same application of trust principles and security principles and apply them now to cross-cloud is a great addition to the capabilities that we're both bringing here.
Yeah, it's so timely for this to be available, to be ready for the experience that you guys have built and grown in this space. And for where, you know, now that we're executing on client projects together, we're super excited. I can tell you, as this starts to open up, it's going to be a deal. It's going to be a thing that folks are going to, we saw this at the beginning of Teams. If you remember, we talked to a lot of clients. We would start talking about Teams, and they would say, "I'm not rolling out Teams.
Right.
No way. Not going to happen. Period. Never going to happen. I can't control it."
Yep.
And they knew that it was either on or off in those early days. And this is before COVID, when Teams just started rolling out. This gives us the ability to start to control things, and especially at scale, allow some level of self-service without completely just leaving things unregulated or unattended to.
Yeah, absolutely.
No doubt. Karen, how are we doing? Do we have any more questions?
No, I think we've actually answered all of the questions. Maybe you both could spend the last couple of minutes letting folks know how they can get in touch if they have any additional questions, and then maybe kind of what's coming down the road for both of you in terms of upcoming webinars or events or anything like that.
Ooh. Wow, Jay, what do you got on tap? What's your? I know you're always speaking about stuff.
Oh, well, I was going to be at both Branson for the North American Collaboration Summit and Nashville for the ARMA Information Management Convention, but I've had to pull out of both of those. My organization will be at both of those, though. So if you find yourself in Branson, Missouri, or you find yourself in Nashville, Tennessee, in the next 2 weeks, do look for AvePoint, and feel free to ask about some of the capabilities that I talked about. I actually, I just wrapped up 10 weeks of travel, and I don't have anything scheduled for the foreseeable future, and I am completely okay with that.
Good for you. I'm glad you're finally getting that break. I know we've been chasing each other while you've been on the road with various things. I've been traveling a little bit. I'm so glad to see you're finally getting that little bit of break and on that end of it. Karen, if you want to bump up to the next, or Jay, bump up to the next slide. I think the one thing that we want to talk a little bit about is this is a series. This is something that we're trying to put together a series of conversations that kind of tie this whole concept together. And that next session is going to be about how do we take some of these concepts around data governance and these things that we're going to do to kind of put gating factors on who can see various types of workspaces and relate that to overall vendor management and supply chain management. Most organizations have some ability or some way of vetting their supply chain and the folks that they work with. How do those programs work? And then how can we tie it all into the things we're talking around collaboration across external clients and especially across the cloud? A couple of other areas I know from a C3 standpoint, we'll have some folks out at Ignite next week, as well as not necessarily exhibiting, but we'll be at Army USA next week as well at the show itself. And there's a constant stream of things that we're going to be at, either exhibiting or sponsoring or being a part of it.
I need a calendar over here. You're right. You're absolutely right. Ignite, we have people out there. I actually have a virtual session for Ignite on Wednesday. Army USA, look for Lon Lane. He's our lead for the Army. And then NLIT, if you support the National Labs, the National Labs IT conference is coming up the week of the 17th. And we have a team of people out there as well. Thank you for God. Bill, I wouldn't know where I was if it wasn't for you.
There you go. Fantastic. Well, I know we're a couple of minutes early, but I think we're at a great break point. We'll give everyone a couple minutes back to their day. Once again, Jay, thank you. It's always a pleasure. It's always fun talking with you on stuff. I know we're going to collaborate on a few more of these in the future, but really appreciate you sitting in and talking with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure entirely. You can see you're more than welcome to, if you're watching, you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn or by email. Also, I'm on Twitter at JAYLEASK, fairly active out there. And actually, there's a great conversation right now going on with people who are in GCC High, and DoD talking about what I wish I knew 6 years ago when we started this journey. So
I'm going to jump in on that. Definitely.
Thanks, Bill.
All right, guys. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time, Jay, your time, Bill. For all of our attendees, thank you for your time and attention as well. And look for an email from us with a link to the full recording of the webinar, as well as the slide deck. So happy Tuesday, and everyone have a good rest of your week. Thanks.